These are the lawyers who represent our two wonderful towns of Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. They come from the law firm, distinguished law firm of Holland and Knight, which, by the way, through their good graces, has been a very generous sponsor of many of our Rotary events. And so I bring to you Vic Filippini, representing Lake Forest, and Peter Friedman, who has represented us on the village board in the village of Lake Bluff. Gentlemen, welcome back to the Lake Forest Lake Bluff Rotary Club.
You know, one of the things, since you've had a nice breakfast, that I'm going to do is try to ruin it for you, because you've probably all heard about the pension predicament in Illinois, and if it's not enough just to hear about it, it should be enough to make you sick. This is something that, although we've heard about it and we know it's a serious concern, I'm not sure that everybody, or in fact anybody, has a full grasp of the problem. I'm not going to suggest that I do either. But I will give you a little bit of a sense as to some of the breadth and depth of the problem and some of the issues that are surrounding it, just so that if you really thought you were having a happy day, I could make it unhappy. First, with respect to that pension problem, I'll give you a few facts. The Pew Center on the States has reported that there's a trillion, that's 3 more zeros than billion, dollar gap in state and various local pension systems. Now, that sounds pretty daunting, but frankly, because pension systems are paid out in advance, most public finance experts say that if you're 80% funded and you invest that money prudently and appropriately, you're actually in good shape. And the Pew report actually indicates that 85% of the pension systems meet that target. So again, relatively good news. But you're in Illinois. And in Illinois, where the pension system, which is not a system, it's actually a group of systems, the total funding of it is between 38 and 54%. Now, as I mentioned, the system is not a single system. Illinois has 12 different pension systems, and among those systems, there are a bunch of local pension systems. In fact, I believe that Lake Forest has at least 3 in its municipal government. Lake Bluff, I believe, 2. And then you have your school pensions, and the fire district, the Knollwood Fire District, has a pension system. So when you start adding it up, and if you look on your tax bill, you'll see a number of these. You'll see that there's actually quite a number of pension systems out there that affect each and every one of us. Now, the number of pension systems and individual pension funds have a range of funding mechanisms, some of which are not so bad, some of which are quite horrible, but as a whole, it is a serious problem. Illinois, because it has so many pension systems and because their governance and their variability in funding is so different, it's very hard to make a generalized solution for the systems because there are so many moving parts. There's also some other complications. When we look at the pension systems in Illinois and measure whether it's fully funded or sufficiently funded or not, there are some standards that are used, one of which is an actuarial standard. The actuarial standard is, I believe, from 1992, and its assumption in terms of longevity is falling far short of the mark of what it is today. I believe it's about 4.3 years less than what, in fact, the current expected longevity is for those people who would be in those pension systems. So when you measure it and you're using the wrong actuarial standard, your gap is actually a little bit larger. The other thing is that when they make the assumptions as to whether or not you are adequately funded, they use an investment assumption. And that investment assumption is usually about 7%. Guess what? Pension funds don't make 7%. You may say, well, wait a minute. If you look over the long term, investments probably do range 7%, maybe even a little higher. That's probably true, but not so true for pension funds. Why? Because pension funds have limitations on what their monies can be invested upon or invested in, and that limitation actually depresses the overall investment opportunities. Now, good news, in a bad market, it usually softens the blow a little bit, but it never really reaches that 7% assumption. So when they're making the projections as to whether you're adequately funded, they're also overstating the value of the asset that's to be funding those pension benefits. So we have some bigger problems than are even stated when you get the full actuarial report. Are you all feeling good about this now? Now, when we talk about Illinois, you know, I mean, you probably read the headlines, because I think about 4 months ago, the Better Government Association came out with a headline that was blasted both across the Tribune and the Sun-Times about the $1 Million Club, talking about former legislators and state officials who will be making more than $1 million in their pensions, some of which were getting, you know, close to $200,000 a year in their pensions. And we all say, oh, well, that's terrible. That must be the problem. Well, frankly, that's not the problem. The reason why that's not the problem is that our state constitution has a specific provision that protects pension benefits. So if somebody has vested in their pension, they have a constitutional right for that. You've probably heard some of the commercials. I think it's the teachers union that's been on the airwaves lately, and they say, you know, we've worked for that pension, we've earned that pension, and now the state hasn't come true. Well, there's a little bit of truth and a little bit of fiction in that. The truth is, in fact, for those who are vested, they have a legal right. They have earned that pension. They are entitled to it. One of the things that, you know, may differentiate individuals who are in the private sector and the public sector is that nowadays, I think more, if not most people in the private sector, to the extent that they have retirement benefits, have a defined contribution program, you know, your 401ks and things like that. In the public sector, they're defined benefits. So you're entitled to an amount irrespective of what you put in. Now, therein lies one of the issues here, because in looking at the pension problem, you may remember 2 years ago there was a pension fix that was adopted by the General Assembly. But that fix was prospective only. It's only for those who were hired after that new pension law was put in place. And what it did was it ratcheted down the benefits. So when you look at the benefits under the pension fix, they were going to be something more manageable, something that could be funded presumably, and therefore would not be a problem. What it didn't address were all of those persons who were already in a pension system. And so you go throw up your hands and say, well, we can't do anything about that. That's what the Constitution says. Well, not exactly. That's what you sometimes hear people talk about who are, you know, have an interest in this, or legislators who don't want to necessarily get into the crossfire of this. But what the Constitution says is that the benefit is constitutionally protected, not the funding mechanism. And one of the things that can be done is that the pension funding system can be changed. There was a time when the pension participants and the governmental employees paid roughly the same amount into the pension system. Over time, benefits were increased legislatively, and ordinarily, what happened to fund that additional increase was the increase was put on the governmental employer to make the difference up. Not entirely. I mean, both sides ratcheted up, but it was disproportionately on the employer. The outcome of that is that many governmental units didn't fund, and now we have this gap. That goes from the state to localities to special units, the whole business. Now, that can be changed by rebalancing how the funding occurs. And, you know, that won't affect anyone who's already retired and receiving their pension. But it could be done in a way that gives people an option. If they're still working, they can either pay a higher amount or they can go into a different pension system by voluntary choice. The problem is that nobody in Springfield wants to deal with this. Why? There are interests going all sorts of different ways. It's a very complicated issue, and there's no ultimate solution. It's going to be a painful outcome no matter what. But rather than face the pain, it's easier to kick the can, and frankly, that's what we've seen. There was a lot of discussion earlier in this session of the General Assembly that there might be a solution. Some of you might have been, and in fact I know a couple of you were at our seminar back in April, and Rich Miller from Capital Watch, or Capital Facts rather, was on a panel, and he projected that nothing's going to happen because it's just too complicated. Well, the General Assembly completed its session. They're now in the veto session, and so far nothing has happened, and frankly, nothing is expected to. So, bon appetit.
So Vic is coming back, so you don't have to applaud him 3 or 4 times this morning. It'll make his day. So I'm Peter Friedman. I was a little late today, but I have 20 happy dollars because as soon as I got on the road this morning, I called Vic, and I was 20 minutes behind him on the Edens, and I got here 5 minutes after he did. And I did not get a speeding ticket. So that's what I'm happy about today. Chief, I will say that I know you were born 2 days after the last Cubs World Series loss, and you'll be happy to know that the guys that are in charge now were born like 2 decades after you. I don't know if anyone, I'm getting off track. I don't know if anybody saw their press conference yesterday, but their new GM, who looks, you know, like an 18-year-old, got asked a couple of very hard questions, one about Aramis Ramirez, and he just sat there and didn't say anything, and Theo then said, I'll answer that question. This is the GM not being able to answer a question about Aramis Ramirez. But anyways, I'm sure they'll win a World Series this year. So Vic just gave us, I'm going to cover 2 topics today. We're going to go back and forth. I could either talk about the Reverend George Michael, that's one of my topics, or I could talk about something that's good news, I think, which is electric aggregation. Since Vic just talked about bad financial news, I think I'll talk about electric aggregation first, and then I'll finish up with Mr. Michael and the litigation that... There's a lot of George Michaels out there, but there's only one Lake Bluff George Michael. Actually, you can do this for me if you'd like. Okay. So anyways, electric aggregation. This is the good news, actually, that's going on in the state. The one financial piece that seems to be working in the favor of municipalities and their residents in a relatively simple, straightforward, logical, workable, cost-effective solution. I'm talking about Illinois. And I'm talking about something that ComEd has something to do with. A few years ago, or a year, a little over, the General Assembly amended the Illinois Power Agency Act, which is a huge, huge statute, but there's now a new section in it that provides that it does what the market had already done, and it codifies it in Illinois. It decouples for purposes of electric supply to residents and quote, small commercial retail users, and I'll get to that in a minute. The transportation of power versus the supplier of power. Under this statute and under the program, residents can now choose their supplier, notwithstanding the fact that ComEd is still the transporter and the conduit for that power, and notwithstanding the fact that there are still ComEd bills that residents will always receive. But now the supplier of the power can be a whole host of different suppliers, and there are a lot of them out there. And the General Assembly, to their credit, created a program to at least try to create some structure to the fact that it would not serve, and it would be complicated, and it would there would be savings that would be lost if we just let any supplier try to get into all the residents and the small commercial users. It would be disorganized. The residents would not get the savings because they would not know, they would not have the information before them. There would not be this conduit of information and a program. So what the General Assembly did is it said, look, if a municipality wants to provide, and all the municipality does here is like the front man for allowing the residents and the commercial users to make their own decision as to who they want to supply them power. They can continue to have ComEd supply the power, notwithstanding the fact that ComEd's rates are, based on experience, 25 to 35% higher than these new suppliers are willing to charge. Or they can allow, residents can go to the supplier that the municipality or municipalities has bid for and secured a lockdown bid for power, or they can respond, residents and commercial use can respond to whatever newspaper advertisement, mailing they get, advertisement at 3 o'clock in the morning on TV about the supplier. They can do whatever they want. You've seen them on the Edens and the Kennedy. There are billboards now about these suppliers who want their business. The way the statute works is there are two basic processes. There's an opt-in process and an opt-out process. And I'll do the opt-out process first. The opt-out process is if a municipality wants to do this program, there's a referendum that is held asking the residents whether they want the village to adopt an ordinance instituting an opt-out process. And that means if that referendum passes, simple majority of those voting, that the municipality will then go out, create its own plan of governance and competitive bidding process for seeking bids for its residents. And each municipality is different with regard to the load and the type of power that the municipality needs based on the size of its homes, where the power lines are, et cetera. The municipality will get those bids, get the best bid, and then will send out a notice to the residents that will say, okay, we've got XYZ Corporation that's willing to provide you power at X cents per kilowatt hour. Unless you opt out, you will begin to receive that power from that supplier. The opt-out rate, as you can imagine, is very small. Not only because it's a good deal, but just because when given the choice, residents to have to do something or not do something, they usually look at it and say, okay, I'm not going to do anything. In this case, doing nothing is a good thing. That's the opt-out process. And then if the opt-in process is the reverse. Doesn't require the referendum, but the municipality goes out, finds the suppliers, provides that information to the residents, and then residents have to actually affirmatively opt into that. The opt-in rate is far, far less. Plus, when you go to suppliers and you ask them for rates, and they bid on rates, and the way this works in the market is when they get a bid, or when they get a request for a bid, their rate, they buy their rate on the market to secure it, because they're obviously not starting to supply that rate immediately when they're awarded the contract. It takes about a month or a month and a half to actually get the residents to do what they need to do to get the power. So they buy that rate. The opt-in rate, the actual kilowatt hour rate, is usually less because at the time they are buying that rate, they don't know how many residents are actually going to opt in. And if they generally the larger number, the larger the load for a particular area, the better they can do on the rate. So the opt-in, there's just a experiential calculation that it's going to be a smaller number. The opt-out number is far, far greater. 80%, 90% stay in the program, and so they can do their math and their calculation, and the rates for the opt-in or the opt-out are far, far greater for the municipality and its residents.
By greater, you mean better?
Greater, less. Less is better. So an example of how this works. Now the other element of this that's good is that municipalities can join with other municipalities to create larger loads and bigger groups. I know that Lake Forest, Lake Bluff are in discussions with a lot of other municipalities to do this. Another municipality for which we serve as village attorney, Oak Brook, as well as Grays Lake and Lincolnwood, 3 municipalities that we represent, all have just completed this process. And they are now in the part of the process where they are sending out opt-out notices. They came together, Grays Lake particularly did a lot, has been working on this since December, November of 2010, and got a bid from Integris. And the Integris bid for 2 years, a lockdown rate for 2 years was, for residential, was about 5.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which is about, for power, 30% less than ComEd per kilowatt hour. There's only one rate in the state, small community in the northwest portion, or I think western Erie, Illinois, very small, 1,500 people community. They got a slightly better rate than that. But so far, that's the best rate in Illinois in the aggregation process. I am sure that it may be beat because now we're getting larger groups of municipality coming together to do these competitive bid requests, and so the rate they get may be better. But it also depends. I mean, the the market for energy is fluctuating, and so it's hard to tell where that rate's going to go. But there's no question that the aggregation process has resulted so far in real savings. A couple other elements of it, because there's often confusion about this. Your ComEd bill includes more charges than just power, unfortunately. There's taxes. ComEd still gets to charge for the transportation of the power. So when we talk about 30% savings, it's off the power charge on the ComEd bill. It's not 30% off the entire bill, but nevertheless, still 30% off the largest chunk of the power bill. The other thing I would say is a couple interesting things happened in the Lincolnwood, Oak Brook, Grays Lake experience. And particularly happened to Oak Brook. As they issued the competitive bid, Integris came back with its offer. The bids were accepted. The corporate authorities had authorized the managers to accept the best bid at the opening because you couldn't wait for the next board meetings because they needed to lock down the rates. The bids were accepted, and on the literally on the eve of Oak Brook's adoption of the ordinance accepting or entering into the power supply agreement with Integris, an ad appeared in the local newspaper from a competing energy supplier who did not submit a bid, saying we can beat that rate for Oak Brook residents by about 20%, and which would make that the lowest rate from an aggregation supplier in Illinois. And it appeared in an ad, and it basically was an ad saying Village Board don't adopt the Integris bid, which put the board in a very interesting position. And they immediately had a meeting with this supplier, literally 2 hours before the board meeting, and they went with Integris. The board went with Integris. One, because they honored the competitive bidding process, as I think they correctly did. Two, Integris had locked down the rate. There was an agreement in front of the board that guaranteed that rate contractually for 2 years. The advertisement was no guarantee of anything. And while they were at the board meeting saying, we will guarantee this, we'll sign something right after this meeting, that was not, the whole program is very, very public. There are public hearings before required before the program is adopted. So the moral of that is the suppliers, there's a lot of them out there, and they are very, very aggressive, very, very entrepreneurial is one way to put it, but also just very, very aggressive in how they approach both your residents and the corporate authorities as well. And I think the best, our view is the best strategy is to follow the process. 30% off the power is 30% off the power, and it's a bird in the hand, and you don't know, and the difference between on the actual bill of that half a penny per kilowatt hour over a year is not so great to risk, maybe not getting that deal when push comes to shove and somebody's got to sign a document. So it was an interesting, the only other thing I would add is, these three communities got together, and what came out in that is that, yes, the larger load is better and reduces the price. There was some discussion by both this rogue supplier, that I'll refer to them as, about that Oak Brook's requirement for power was somehow of a different nature because of the size of its homes and its residential makeup, and because it has a lot of gated communities versus a newer type community in Grays Lake or Lincolnwood. And so there was a lot of discussion about what the right makeup of these municipalities are when they intergovernmentally cooperate to get these rates. I think at the bottom line of all that was that to whatever extent there may have been a different power requirement for Oak Brook, it was overcome by the benefit of loading up with a larger load factor and more demand by doing it with 2 other municipalities. That was the key driving force of the price, not necessarily the difference in power needs. So it's a good program. It's working. You're going to all hear about it coming up. Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead. Is a franchise.
Yeah, the public building issue is a franchise issue. That's the use of the streets for the actual facilities that the power company has. So that's unchanged by this. There will be an expected drop in the utility tax revenue, and that's something that the municipalities are going to have to deal with. I think that at least in Grays Lake and Oak Brook and Lincolnwood, those communities all felt that the savings to the residents was a far more important issue than how they're going to fill the budget gap. That's a policy decision at the outset, but I think that's the policy decision that we've seen in every community that's addressed it squarely so far.
And Neil, the General Assembly and the statute does not address it at all. So it is, as Vic said, there's nothing by law. There's nothing by law that responds to that, other than local governments.
Well, at this point, I don't believe either Lake Bluff or Lake Forest has actually passed the necessary resolution or ordinance to kick off the referendum. That's obviously an issue that could come up in the context of that. Yeah, again, all of them, as I understand it, decided the benefit is so much clearly outweighing the cost to their bottom line that there was no reason not to proceed.
I think that's right. Yeah, let's hold off on the questions. We've got a couple more.
Well, you know what? I think our time is running short, so let's go to the questions. I was just going to tell you there's a new case that if you all thought you're expected to know what the law means, there's a new appellate court decision that says, well, maybe not. It's a bad decision, but, you know, that happens.
All I'll say is that I know Vic said he kept somebody out of jail. I not only kept Trustee Barkhausen and Trustee Lesser out of federal court and treble damages, but I also got Trustee Lesser promoted to a doctor, medical doctor. The chief has never been named as a defendant since I've been village attorney. Trustee Dewart has not been in office long enough to get in trouble, as far as I know. And unfortunately, I do have Trustee O'Hara and Village Administrator Irvin, who I'm trying like crazy to get them out of a lawsuit dealing with the Reverend Michael. I'm sure you do. So if anybody wants to talk about Reverend Michael, we can.
But we are thinking of trying to make both of you reverends. So questions? Or not? If I heard your question right, there are some borrowings and notes going back and forth to try to structure the funding of it. There are, at different levels. Ultimately, those don't change the bottom line in terms of financing, or I should say funding the pension funds. They do provide, to some degree, an investment line which is a little more secure. We actually have a couple of clients that entered into an intergovernmental agreement where each of them issued bonds for the other to invest in. Both of the communities were AAA and AA plus respectively, and that at least gave them a better bottom line on the investment. But when you get down to it, they still were backed by tax dollars. So what it did was it helped improve. I mentioned that projected investment goal that's used for the calculations. It actually made that closer to reality, but it didn't do anything in terms of lessening the ultimate burden on the taxpayers for funding the pensions.
Well, this is very complicated. I'm a banker.
Yes.
And when you take an investment, when you put a note in an investment,
I believe that the state has both invested in or has taken out loans or bonds from others to fund theirs, and they've also issued notes.
Sure, and the ability to repay that is a little unclear at this time, as we know. Yeah. Because they're borrowing over here to make the payments over here. This is all smoke and mirrors. Last question, quick answer. Do you think the state of Illinois could someday go bankrupt?
I'll answer. Has anybody read the book Boomerang? Same guy who wrote Moneyball, thinking of Theo Epstein, and it talks all about that government debt can default. That it is silly for us to suggest that because it's government debt that it can't default. It does happen, and not just at the municipal level, but at the country level. Look what's going on with Greece. I mean, that it is, at some point, there will be defaults unless there's structural change. And it's not just, it's structural change. It's not just reducing spending. It's real structural change.
And one other thing I should mention on that, the type of note or bond makes all the difference. Not to get too complicated, but there are all different types of debt instruments that governments can issue. There are general obligation. Those are the ones you ought to be buying. There are revenue-based bonds or notes. Those can be good if the stream of revenue that is dedicated to it is a solid one. And there are what are called promissory bonds. Those are the ones that you ought to stay clear of because they usually don't have a GO backing, a general obligation backing, and they don't have a revenue stream dedicated to it. It's a trust me. Take your own guidance on whether you want to trust the state on these things at this time. Yes, sir. The question is whether the constitutional clause in the Illinois Constitution preclude an increase in contribution or just protect the benefit. It only protects the benefit. And in fact, Peter and I wrote a memo about 4 years ago when this discussion was really starting to ramp up. And we identified the analysis under the existing case law that would justify a change in the contribution formula that would not be inconsistent with the constitutional guarantee. And if you actually go to the website of Illinois taxpayers or whatever it is, you'll see that they have, I think they even have a link to our memo. I'm not sure how they got it.
It's one of the only, if you Google our names, that's really all that comes up.
Yeah.
It's sad, but it's true.
Yeah.
If one of the pension funds should default, is the obligation released through that default?
The question is, if a pension fund should default, is the obligation released? Good question, and it may depend on which pension fund it is. In Illinois, there is no clear right for a governmental unit to go bankrupt. I don't know what happens at that point, but there's no constitutional right for them to go bankrupt because the pension is an obligation of them, and theoretically, they would have an obligation in turn to have to tax their taxpayer base in order to make up that deficit. If it's a state pension, there's not the same clear obligation under the state pension other than that the benefit is guaranteed by the Constitution. The Constitution does not define a remedy for that. How that would ever be resolved is for a court to decide. One would hope that the General Assembly will step up and finally try to find a solution rather than go to the brink and see what happens. Correct. Yeah. Those folks, you know who we're talking about.
So the first question, there would be a default back to ComEd if the supplier failed and wasn't supplying the power. No, at the ComEd rate. It would if ComEd's supplying the power, ComEd's going to charge their rate, and if the contract is only, there may be remedies depending on what the actual default is and what happens. If it's bankruptcy and they go defunct, you know, the remedies are not going to be worth much. What was the second part of the question?
How are they able to be so aggressive?
Oh.
Are they buying their power? Not buy the power.
You may have some thoughts on this too. I think ComEd has a lot more sunken costs, and all these guys are doing are going wholesale and on the open market and bidding down the price of power. And ComEd, I think, is still banking on the fact that most of the people are still going to be paying the ComEd rate, even with electric aggregation, and even, you know, ComEd is not just in Illinois; it's everywhere. But they're still going to, having their rate is still going to get them more money than trying to reduce their rate to compete with these suppliers, because they're also still getting all those other charges I talked about that are going to, you know, help their revenues as well.
Yeah, three things. I think ComEd has made a structural and strategic decision that their distribution services is going to be their primary business as far as that goes. As far as the production, they've actually broken that off from the utility part of the company, and they're one of the ones producing and on the market. Two other points on this. One, when you bid, Peter mentioned that you got to approve these right away. One of the reasons why it's a very volatile market and the prices swing to a pretty significant degree on a day-to-day basis. So the folks who are going out there and making the bids are aggressive, but they're also locking in their contracts down, you know, up and down the line to make sure it's there. And then the third thing is, and your question raises a very significant point, if somebody, you know, how do you know that they're going to be good for it? Well, that's part of the due diligence that needs to be done in terms of the bidding documents and the like. And I think Oak Brook, when it came down to it, one of the reasons why it didn't go with the ne'er-do-well latecomer who put the ad in the paper was there wasn't any due diligence nor any clear protections on the backside if they didn't perform. I think that our time is up, so I'm going to give this back to David. Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, thank you all, and thank you for being an attentive audience and staying a little overtime today. And thank you again to our friends from Holland and Knight and for all they've done and continue to do for our Rotary Club. Thank you, gentlemen.